After years and years of integration, the cooling of relations between China and the United States, as well as Europe, is now a reality. This can be seen in the massive outflow of capital from China, with net capital outflow reaching its highest level in 7 years as of September. Additionally, there has been a significant decline in foreign direct investment, as you can see over the past few years. Dear friends, the trade war initiated by the Trump administration in 2018 and the growing geopolitical rivalry have made many Western companies think twice before continuing to invest in the Asian giant. The problem is that this process of integration with China has been one of the key drivers of global economic growth in recent decades. But that might be coming to an end. The opening of China's economy is no longer continuing. We need to move away from the idea that China's policy is still primarily geared toward economic growth. China now seeks to be impregnable and more self-sufficient, aiming to compete for future markets and technologies. And precisely for this reason, we've asked ourselves a few questions. Is China really separating from the West? Is it true, as many experts and analysts claim, that globalization could retreat in the coming years? What consequences could this process have? Hello to all the community of Finance for All, welcome to another video. India is trending in 2023 and 2024. Not only has it become the most populous country in the world, but I'm also completely sure that the vast majority of you have seen headlines like these in recent months. India and ASEAN gain strength as alternatives for investment amid a declining China, September 13, 2023. India is attracting foreign investment on a large scale, and more eyes are turning toward this country. Washington, of course, is no exception. In the eyes of the Biden administration, India is seen as the best possible alternative to China, a country that could become a key player in global markets in the coming years. That's why President Joe Biden himself announced a new financial corridor to promote infrastructure investments in India and also declared his support for India to secure a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. These are two examples of political and economic engagement at an unprecedented level. June 21, 2023, the US courts Modi to bolster its strategy against China. The Indian Prime Minister will sign defense and technology agreements during a state visit to Washington. Why is this important? Well, as we mentioned earlier, relations between China and the United States are not at their best. This has led many experts to warn that the process of globalization that has unfolded over the past few decades might be at risk. In recent years alone, trade restrictions have been imposed across the globe. In fact, since 2008, global trade as a percentage of GDP has not only stopped growing but has actually declined. As you can see, this marks a complete reversal of the trend from the previous 4 decades. The reasons for this change? Well, much of it has to do with China's own development. As the country has grown wealthier and more industrialized, 2 things have happened. On the one hand, its demand for foreign intermediate goods has decreased. China is increasingly using more Chinese-made products in its manufacturing processes. In other words, China has shifted from being merely an assembler to producing more complex products. On the other hand, as the Chinese have become wealthier, they've started to retain a larger share of their own production. This explains, for example, that while in 2008, international trade accounted for over 60% of China's GDP, today that figure has fallen below 40%. We're talking about a drop of more than 20 points in just over 10 years, an important contraction. This, dear friends, is what many are calling the Great Decoupling. However, wait a moment, because this is not the whole story. The emergence of India could trigger a new wave of globalization. Now, the rise of India and other countries in the region, such as Vietnam or Indonesia, could not only compensate for the cooling relations between the United States and China but could even end up sparking a new wave of globalization. Together, countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and even Bangladesh are enormous. We're talking about a population that exceeds 2 billion people, now experiencing accelerated economic development. These countries can take over and become the new drivers of a large portion of global production and the demand for high value-added products. In other words, all signs point to them replicating the success that China brought to the world between 2000 and 2020. And let's not forget that during that time, China managed to control almost 30% of the world's industrial production. 1 in every 3 final products came from Chinese factories. That's an impressive figure. So, if Asia's new rising stars manage to replicate this success, it would represent a significant leap forward, to say the least. And along these lines, at the beginning of 2023, The Economist introduced the concept of Altasia. And what is Altasia? Essentially, it's a collection of East Asian countries, excluding China. In Altasia, you find highly developed countries like Japan and South Korea, as well as emerging ones like Vietnam. The interesting part, according to The Economist, is that these countries are expected to become more economically and commercially integrated in the coming years. And the British aren't the only ones who think so. The case for Altasia is that it could create an alternative supply chain to replace China. If South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan provide advanced technology and capital, Singapore offers financing and logistics, and India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines supply labor and resources, these countries together would surpass China in population. They have more highly skilled workers, lower wage costs, and in many cases, a strong export orientation. In other words, they have everything needed to develop large-scale production chains. This, dear friends, aligns perfectly with the flying geese economic theory, which suggests that multinational companies are constantly seeking cheaper locations for their production centers. When they invest in a country, that country becomes wealthier and begins producing more complex goods, which in turn drives up wages. As wages rise, investors quickly shift their focus to other markets, and the cycle repeats. But that's not all. China will also play a significant role. Let me explain. The Asian giant will invest in and trade with all of these countries. For instance, Vietnam already consumes a large number of intermediate products made in China, which it buys to use in its assembly, production, and export processes. In other words, far from slowing down globalization, we might be on the verge of seeing this global integration process accelerate even further in the coming years. On October 24, 2022, it was reported that in 2017, Apple listed 18 major suppliers in India and Vietnam. By last year, that number had increased to 37. In 2023, Apple began making its new iPhone in India, where previously it only produced older models. The month before, it was reported that Apple would soon start manufacturing its MacBook laptops in Vietnam, and nearly half of its AirPods are already made there. To give you an idea, the percentage of Apple products made outside of China is expected to increase fivefold in the next 2 years, from 5% to 25%. And as I've mentioned, it's not just the Cupertino-based company. Companies like Sony, Adidas, and Samsung are following the same path. Want a truly surprising fact? According to the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency, 63% of multinational companies are preparing to move more than a quarter of their production capacity from China to countries like India or Vietnam. This explains why China's market share in US imports has been steadily declining, while imports from the rest of Asia continue to rise. But be careful, because everything we're seeing here means that supply chains, far from breaking down, are actually lengthening. And this, friends, can be very good for international trade. Why? Because now manufacturing processes involve more countries. Imagine that before, a computer was made in China and sold to the US. Now, with the extension of the supply chain, that computer, which still has many Chinese-made parts, is no longer assembled in China but in another country like Indonesia, Vietnam, or Mexico. Of course, this entire process will create winners and losers along the way. Competition will increase, and many companies that have made China their industrial hub may now have to invest massive amounts of money to adapt to this new reality. So, the question we ask ourselves is, why should we care about this? Because this process can generate many opportunities. On one hand, companies that adapt best may achieve significant efficiency improvements. Other Western companies will gain new markets for their products, and, of course, we will also see the development of large local companies. In the coming years, it's very likely that we'll see big multinationals replicate in these countries the huge success that companies like Apple or Volkswagen once had in China. At the same time, in India, Indonesia, the Philippines, or Vietnam, we'll witness the rise of companies similar to what Alibaba was in China, Hyundai in South Korea, or TSMC in Taiwan. Pay close attention to this enormous source of opportunities. The world is changing, and if we're alert, we can benefit greatly. As you can see, globalization is perhaps far from collapsing, with all the implications that brings. Now that we've come to this point, the question is for you: do you think India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other emerging Asian economies will be able to emulate China's success? Do you agree with some analysts who argue that, despite everything, globalization will collapse in the coming years? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and let's open up a debate. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.